how the third-party service works. We know that we want signed in to be based on something, some condition, and we want clicking sign in to make it true and sign out to make it false. So if we had some sort of user system, we would probably have unique identifiers for each user, and that's something we could store in state. So let's think about doing that. When we set up our initial state in app, we're currently setting up just notes as an empty object. We could also add UID and just make that null. So you're not logged in as anyone right at first. So then we can make sure that clicking on the sign in button changes that so that it's not null anymore. And we can make sure that signing out changes it back to null. So we need methods to do those things. So under signed in, I'm going to make a new method that's going to handle authentication. We don't know exactly how it's going to work long term, but one thing we do know is that we want to set the UID on state. I'm going to call this auth handler. And the way I want it to work, because it would be convenient, is if this gets past some sort of user object. You don't need to type this. I'm just demonstrating something that looks like this. UID, some big long thing, comma, name, something like that, some sort of user object. So I'm going to give it an argument called user. And then I'm going to set state, this.set state. And I want to set that user ID key, UID. And I want it to be user.uid. So I'm going to have to pass in an object that has a UID field, a UID key. So let's make it so that sign in has such a thing. So sign in is going to call auth handler for us. So here's sign in. Let's pass in a prop, because in order for it to call this, that's what we'll have to do. Auth handler equals curly brace this dot auth handler. Right? Why do we have to do this? Because auth handler must live on app, because that's the component where the state lives. So in order to modify that from a different component, we have to pass in a method as a prop to do that. So over in our sign-in component, now we're passing in a prop called auth handler. So let's go ahead and destructure that here. And now we need an on-click handler here. On click, let's call a method called authenticate. Not this dot authenticate, because this isn't a class, right? This is just a function. But we can totally create functions inside functions. They're just like other local variables. So if I say const authenticate equals an arrow function, that'll work just fine. And what authenticate is going to do is call this auth handler method and pass it in an object that must have a UID, right? Because we're relying on that being there on the other side. So UID, for right now, I'm just going to hard code dstruce. Put the username of your choice there. So when we click sign in, it's going to call auth handler, passing in an object that has a UID. And what auth handler does is set state, specifically the UID key on state, to the value at the UID key of the object that was passed in. So what's supposed to happen is I click the button, and now this .state.uid is set to something. So let's change the implementation of signed in here. Instead of just returning true, what should it return? How do we know if we're logged in or not? What happens when we log in? We set this .state.uid, right? So how about signed in returns this .state.uid? If we're not signed in, it'll be null, which is falsy. If we are signed in, it'll be something. That answers the question, are we signed in or not? Let's try it. Right now, I've got just the sign in button. Let's look at our React Dev Tools. Look at the app component. Over here, I see notes. I see my notes from Firebase, and I see UID null. If I click sign in, I see UID destruce, and everything shows up. See why? We're not really doing anything. We're just setting something in state. But since that thing in state is what we're checking to decide whether to show things, this works. This sets up our basic workflow. So now what should sign out do? Let's make another one called sign out. What should that do? We're signed in if we have a UID. We're signed out if we don't. So to go from signed in to sign out, what must I do? Cameron? UID back to null. Sounds good. So this dot set state object UID colon null. So now the sign out button needs to be able to do this. Here's the sign out component in JSX. So let's pass in set state equal to curly brace this dot sign out. I meant sign out, not set state. This dot sign out. So in sign out component, I should have an on click. On click equals, well, now we're receiving our prop here, right? So let's make sure we grab that, sign out. So then we can set the on click to just that sign out method. Doesn't need any arguments. So get it? We click sign in, what happens? The UID gets set in state. We click sign out, what happens? The UID gets removed from state. And how do we know whether we're signed in or not? We just check. This signed in method just returns this.state.uid. Null will be like false. Anything else will be like true. And we're already making it so that it either renders main or sign in, depending on whether that signed in method returns true or false. Do you understand this approach, why I'm doing it this way? So without really knowing how signed in should be implemented, I want to make it so that I can test this workflow of signing in and out. I'm just kind of making a fake authenticate method that just hard codes a user ID. Because I don't know yet how I'm going to get that. So now if you look at this, and you can watch state down here. So I sign in, my notes show up. I sign out, it all goes away. Now my notes are still there. But never mind. Sign in, sign out. Make sense? Implement basic, sign in, sign out, sign in out, workflow or flow.